Farming has changed over the past few years, with many family farms having to either close down or get with the times by becoming industrialized. And as scary as this may seem to the humble farmer, it's nothing compared to the changes that have already taken place since the first group of humans decided to leave the hunting and gathering lifestyle behind them. But what is the history of this necessary industry that has kept us going all these years, and could we ever know who the very first farmer in the world was? Well, whether you're a farming fanatic or just want to know more about the exciting history behind it, you've come to the right place, as we're about to explore everything there is to know about the origins of our modern-day farming industry. So strap yourselves in and get ready for an informative ride, as things are about to get interesting. But before we get into it, make sure to leave a like and subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss out on any of the new videos we post. The need for farming. Unfortunately for us, farming as a process seemed to develop so long ago that there's really no evidence to indicate where and why it might have started. That being said, experts on the scene have done their best to make some pretty impressive assertions with the use of both archaeological findings and research pertaining to the specific strands of DNA found in the bodies that are both alive and dead at the moment. Sounds a bit crazy when listed like this, right? But we'll be sure to catch you up on the science behind this research a little bit later. But for now, let's just start with the very basis of agriculture. For those of you who haven't really thought about it, agriculture is the practice of cultivating both plants and livestock. And the very simple fact of the matter is that there was no such need for the practice when human beings first decided to get together. Using their rational minds, the earliest human beings came to the conclusion that the chances of survival were almost tripled by surviving in a group with varying skills and abilities. This led to small groups of hunters and gatherers. These tribes of people survived by following their specific roles. While the majority of men would join hunting parties and hunt for food to feed the larger group, the majority of women would stay back at the encampment and pick a range of berries. If a larger meal was caught by the men, these gathered resources would be used as an accompaniment to the meal. Otherwise, these resources would be eaten in their entirety. But as you can tell, this sort of survivability is only possible when a group is not very big. As the group grows, so does the demand for food, and as the demand for food increases, so does the impact that the small group is making on the environment around them. But since there was safety in numbers and large groups were very much necessary to survive, our earlier brothers and sisters had to come up with a process to meet the higher demands of the larger groups. By cultivating both plants and livestock, the earliest farmers of these groups were able to have a constant supply of food. As the group increased in size, so could the farm in question. In other words, if it wasn't for the practice of farming, the earliest humans would have never been able to create towns or even cities. And since large hubs are necessary for trading, the agricultural process made this possible, showing just how important the humble farmer has been from the very beginning of our history. The first farmer. With there being a definite need for farming due to an increase in the settlements of tribes, someone must have been behind the invention of this practice. And while this may very well be the case, the answer is unfortunately too far out of our reach at the moment, and has depended for centuries on the perspective of those trying to find the answer. From a religious perspective, for example, you could probably say that Adam was the first farmer, as his relationship with Eve gave rise to Cain and Abel, who together farmed the land they found themselves on. From a scientific perspective, though, there's no evidence that either of these people actually existed. In fact, there's a general lack of evidence overall due to the massive amount of time that's passed since farming began. And considering how the majority of early farmers could perform their duties before writing became a learnable skill, it's not like we have any records in existence that can still give us the answer to this specific question. In fact, the evidence that does exist at the moment seems to suggest that there was no first farmer at all, at least none that can be differentiated from another. This is due to the fact that global research has indicated that agriculture actually began to develop independently in different parts of the world. This includes a diverse range of cultures which, when divided up, comes down to 11 centers of origin as far as farming is concerned. Wild grains, for example, were collected and eaten around 105,000 years ago, with crops such as emmer, wheat, hulled barley, lentils, and chickpeas being cultivated in Levant around 11,500 years ago. The history of farming is, however, different when it comes to the Orient, who cultivated rice without any influence from any other part of the world between 11,500 and 6200 BC. The same can be said when it comes to the domestication of animals, with the earliest inferences of domesticated sheep being in Mesopotamia somewhere between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. The science isn't exact when it comes to carbon dating such as this, which is where we depend on dates. But what is clear from the research is that groups tended to come up with the process of farming very much on their own. Which group was the first, though? Well, this is next to impossible to say, but let's take a look at the earliest civilizations of the world and see what answers lie in wait. The earliest civilizations. First up, we have Eurasia, which started with the settlement of the Sumerians somewhere around 8000 BC. This growing population decided to settle between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, as they were all well aware that the flowing water was worth its weight in gold. What this also allowed for was one of the first running canal irrigation systems that allowed for the farmlands to be watered without having to run back and forth with buckets. Plows then started to appear in pictographs around 3000 BC, a solid 5,000 years later, with speed plows being pictured sometime later in 2300 BC. The Egyptians had a very similar history, with ancient Egyptian farming being mostly reliant on the flow of the Nile River. The great thing about the Nile is that it would constantly flood its banks, allowing for a large amount of sediment to be deposited. This would in turn enrich the soil and make for some pretty impressive farming to take place. Once more, canal systems were established, even though the Sumerians and Egyptians had never met, allowing researchers to conclude that this was nothing more than the next step of human development. Funnily enough, recent reports have actually reported that ancient Egyptians farmed as far back as 10,000 BC during the pre-dynastic era. The first Indian settlements were also known to have a pretty great grip on the agricultural practice, with wheat, barley, and jujube being domesticated in the land around 9000 BC. Archaeological evidence also suggests that an animal-drawn plow was invented in the Indus Valley civilization in 2500 BC, once more showing a link to the civilization of the Sumerians. Water-powered grain mills were then established by the 1st century BC, with heavy plows with iron plowshares and mold boards following in the late 2nd century. Not every society had a solid grasp on farming. Indigenous Australians, for example, who were far more comfortable with a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle, only took to farming and fish trapping around 5,000 years ago, when the practice became necessary as explained before. So strange considering how large the farming community is currently considered to be in modern Australia. The Farming Revolution. In the Middle Ages, the very same regions where farming had developed in the past began to change along with the agricultural practice in general. Due to the creation of new techniques and better understanding of crop diffusion, farms were able to increase their yields, which is great considering how populations were once more increasing in size. Then came the year 1492, which through the Columbian Exchange brought new world crops such as maize, potatoes, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, and manioc to Europe. This also resulted in old crops such as wheat, barley, rice, and turnips being brought to the Americas. Once more, trading of this sort was made possible due to the farming revolution, as towns and cities of a smaller size would have never been able to meet the demands of other traders from far. Irrigation, crop rotation, and fertilizer composition then advanced greatly from the 17th century onward. Things stayed very much the same until the 1900s saw another advancement in farming methodology and equipment. This was the industrial era, after all, which saw mechanization being brought into farmlands in an attempt to increase crop yield once more. This resulted in less of a reliance on human labor and allowed for farms to be assisted by synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and processes of selective breeding. And over the last couple of years, farming has been concentrating on how to better care for soil and ensure that the process is carried out in a far more ecological manner than before. You see, we're now faced with the problem of overuse due to massive population demand, which is why sustainable farming is by far the biggest agricultural practice currently being carried out. So as you can tell, we simply don't have enough information to name a specific inventor of farming, with the majority of research pointing to the fact that this has simply been the result of human need and development. But what do you think about the rich history? Be sure to let us know in the comments section down below.